Eswatini's largest opposition party has said its country should not be used as a dumping ground for the US after Washington sent a group of migrants to the African country. The majority of those deported have been sent to Central and South America, but the Trump administration is pushing for more countries in Africa to accept those it wants to eject.
Eswatini is the latest country to be the recipient of deportees from the United States. But the news has not been welcomed in the small landlocked African kingdom.
We condemn that the bringing of hardcore convicts to our country to mix with our young convicts who still have a chance of to be rehabilitated.
Officials in Eswatini acknowledged the public anger, but said the 5 men pose no threat to the country or its citizens. Earlier this month, 8 deportees finally arrived in the South Sudanese capital, Juba, after a protracted legal battle that saw them diverted to Djibouti for several weeks. All but one of those sent to the 2 African nations have not been deported to their country of origin.
This particular arrangement of the 8 deportees that end up in South Sudan in Juba, it is a deal that was reached between Juba and Washington, D.C. And that's why our reaction and our big question is that U.S., in terms of D.C. and South Sudan, Juba, need to disclose to us what is the deal.
In late June, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the administration could send migrants to a third country, handing a victory to Trump in his pursuit of mass deportations. As well as Eswatini and South Sudan, Rwanda received 1 Iraqi deportee in April this year. Reporting by Axios says over 20 more African countries have been approached or are expected to be asked to take people expelled from the United States. Nigeria has explicitly rejected any proposal by the US. Its foreign minister, Yusuf Tuga, said the country already has enough of its own problems.
And for more of this story, I can now speak to Chris Ogunmodede, a policy analyst and consultant. He specializes in African politics and international relations. He joins us from Lagos in Nigeria. Chris, critics say the US is outsourcing its deportation problem to Africa. What's your take on that?
I think that's correct. I think the United States has come to a point of realizing that perhaps this mass deportation program that President Trump promised is going to turn out to be a lot more difficult and challenging than it had anticipated. And of course, there is precedent from Europe and Australia, for instance, when it comes to outsourcing migrants to third countries. So the Trump administration is simply following that precedent, understanding that it can and has the willingness to use the considerable leverage that it has over African countries to persuade them to accept these migrants.
Now, in Eswatini and also in South Sudan, these arrivals sparked outrage. Is Washington underestimating how politically explosive this policy is there on the ground, or does Washington just not care?
I think it's both. I think Washington is underestimating just how much blowback this arrangement could cause, not just the United States, but also domestic governments who accept these migrants, regardless of how many people are actually accepted. It's an issue that the opposition in several countries can and likely will use to their advantage. But as I say, the Trump administration frankly doesn't care much about how it plays domestically for those governments. There is broadly in the United States, the public does not care much about how the immigration problem is dealt with, as long as it's dealt with, and by dealt with, they mean whatever it takes to get people who are considered to be criminal aliens and the like out of the country. So I don't think that the Trump administration is willing to think too much about the costs to the African governments that it speaks to.
Well, talking about the African governments, why have political leaders in some African countries agreed to this then, and what do they gain from it?
So I think there's a couple of things here. African governments, I should start by saying African governments, when President Trump won his second term, were quite enthusiastic about that, at least a number of them anyway. And they were among the first to congratulate Trump, and they felt that the Biden administration wasn't as proactive and robust in its engagement with them. So they have been anticipating and excited to do deals with the Trump administration, despite the fact that the Trump administration has cut aid to African countries, has slapped tariffs on them, is threatening, and in some cases has actually slapped the visa bans and the like. So in this instance, if they seem keen to at least listen to the discussion, because they believe that if this is going to be a way to curry favor with the Trump administration, what's a couple hundred or perhaps even tens of migrants, especially if there's going to be some financial payout for this, there's no problem as far as that's concerned. That's a risk they're willing to take for the payout of the things that they are seeking from the United States.
Now, what kind of effect do you think will this have on how migration is handled across Africa?
I think it will most likely exacerbate existing trends, such as African governments, particularly ones in here in coastal West Africa, but also in the Sahel, in North Africa, who have been working with the European Union, for instance, to stem migration. It will just be an extension of those pre-existing trends where governments take funding and other elements of bilateral assistance in exchange for helping Western countries deal with some of their migration problems. Despite the fact that the legalities of it are dubious, but there is no real political obstacle either for the United States, European countries, or African governments until, of course, as I say, it poses a problem for them. But that's, to their mind, that's a bridge that they are willing to cross if and when they get there.
Chris Ogunmodede there, policy consultant and analyst. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more, I can now speak to Juma Ayandele. She's an interdisciplinary social scientist who specializes in African politics and a research fellow at NYU Center for Global Affairs. Welcome to DW. Now, tell me, what does all of that tell us about the relationship between Washington and African countries like Eswatini and South Sudan?
Thank you for having me on your segment. I would say, for the most part, it shows that the relationship is still very unequal. The U.S. often sets the terms, as we know, and smaller or fragile African countries are expected to go along. And these deals are often called partnerships, but as we know, they usually reflect the power imbalance. So Washington has more leverage, and that really shapes how decisions are being made with countries such as Eswatini and South Sudan.
What kind of pressure is Washington using here then?
As we know, it's rarely a deal between equals. So even if aid or promises are offered to these countries, the U.S. holds more cards. So I do believe that countries like South Sudan or Eswatini may feel like they don't necessarily have that many options, especially if they are relying on American and U.S. support. So yes, there is pressure, even if this pressure is not always direct.
What kind of pressure would you think we're seeing play out there behind the scenes? Is it economic pressure? Is it just diplomatic pressure? Are we talking about aid? Is it more the economy? Because especially in the case for Eswatini, the U.S. is also a large market. What do you think is behind all this? And what are the leaders of these two countries hoping to get out of it?
Definitely. It is aid, definitely economic aid. I would also say some diplomatic aid and pressures. For these leaders, they are hoping to gain something from, deals with the United States. As we know, the Trump administration has been very transactional with a lot of its bilateral relationships with African countries. So yes, in the short term, I do believe that they will get some financial help with the deportees that are being sent to their countries, or even some political goodwill within the international arena. But I do worry that in the long term, we are going to be seeing a lot of public backlash. We've seen that with Eswatini, or pressure on some of these weak systems for these countries. And this might really outweigh some of the benefits that they might actually have or gain from the United States. So yes, people in these countries are feeling that and questioning their leaders for accepting some of these migrants who have no ties to them. So yes, there might be some payoffs, but these payoffs are uncertain and it might actually backfire.
Backfiring in what way? Do you think they could jeopardize local stability?
Definitely, yes, because these are also fragile states. So many of these countries are already struggling with poverty, as you know, insecurity, weak institutions. So when we are bringing in deportees that don't necessarily belong there, that can really stretch out some of the limited resources that these countries already have, and might even create new tensions between locals on the ground and the deportees that are being brought in, especially if there is no clear plan or support on how they are actually going to be reintegrated into these alternative countries. So that could cause a lot of problems for fragile states such as South Sudan or Eswatini.
Yeah. Most of the deportees, we heard it there, have no ties to the countries they're sent to. This first group going to Eswatini, there are people from Latin America, from Asia. How does this square with basic diplomatic norms or human rights even?
Yeah, definitely. It's a serious problem, as we all have been discussing within policy and academic circles. It goes against basic diplomatic and human rights standards, as we've been taught, as we know it. People actually have a right to be sent back to the countries that they're actually from, or that they have ties to, or that they volunteer to go to themselves. And sending them somewhere random or alternative, or treating them as if that they don't matter, is something that goes against everything that we know within international circles. And I would say it actually treats African countries as if they're all the same, and as if that they are dumping grounds for external borders from the West. It's not fair to anyone, whether it's the deportees or African countries themselves.
That was Jumo Ayandele, a research fellow at NYU Center for Global Affairs. Thank you so much for sharing your view with us today. Thanks.
Thank you.